The space station called Concordance Prime floated in the endless dark between three ancient star systems, and it served as neutral ground for the Galactic Council, where species from across the galaxy came to argue and trade and sometimes make peace. Princess Velastra, Nextorian of the Sanguine Dominion, stepped off her obsidian black shuttle, and every being in the docking bay turned to stare at her. She was beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful, and her skin was pale as moonlight on snow, and her eyes burned with a deep crimson that seemed to glow from within, and her hair fell in waves of pure midnight down her back, and when she walked it was like watching water flow over stone. The other species in the bay felt their hearts beat faster, and their thoughts grew fuzzy and warm, and they found themselves wanting to move closer to her, even though a voice in the back of their minds screamed warnings. This was the power of the Valkyrie, and they were the oldest predators in the known galaxy. Velastra had lived for 847 years, and in that time, she had bent the wills of senators and generals and kings, and she had never once failed to get what she wanted. Her people called her the Crimson Whisper, and lesser species called her the Nightmare Princess, and both names pleased her equally today. She had come to negotiate her empire's entry into the Galactic Council, and she expected it to be simple enough, and perhaps even boring. Her assistant Morthex scurried beside her, and his forearms clutched data tablets, and his compound eyes darted nervously around the bay. "The human delegation has arrived ahead of schedule, my princess," he said in his clicking voice. "They are already waiting in the diplomatic chamber." Velastra raised one elegant eyebrow. "Humans," she repeated, and the word felt strange on her tongue. "The young species from the spiral on." "Yes, my princess, and they have only been spacefaring for 2 centuries. Velastra almost laughed, and 2 centuries was nothing, and her own species have been traveling between stars when humans were still living in caves and painting on walls with their fingers. "This should be amusing," she said, and she smoothed her gown of living shadow and walked toward the diplomatic chamber with the confidence of a predator who had never known what it meant to be prey. The chamber was vast and circular, and filled with representatives from dozens of species, and the Calvari with their crystal bodies, and the Grothmer with their stone skin, and the Whisperkin, who were barely visible in normal light, and many others. But Velastra's attention was drawn immediately to the human delegation. There were 5 of them, and they sat at a curved table near the center, and they looked so fragile and so soft and so very young. Their leader stood as she entered, and he was a man of middle years, with dark hair going gray at the temples and warm brown skin and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Princess Velastra," he said, and his voice was calm and steady. "I am Ambassador Marcus Chen, and on behalf of the United Earth Government, I welcome you to these negotiations." Velastra glided toward him, and she let her power flow outward like a gentle tide, and the other species in the room swayed slightly as her influence washed over them. This was her first secret, and she called it the Whisper of Want. She reached out with her mind and touched the ambassador's thoughts, and she searched for his desires and his dreams and his secret wishes, and she would find them and reflect them back at him, and he would believe that helping her was his own idea, and he would never even know he had been manipulated. It was elegant, and it was subtle, and it had never failed her in 8 centuries. She locked her crimson eyes with his brown ones, and she pushed her power deep into his mind, and she waited for the familiar sensation of his will bending toward hers. But something was wrong. His mind was not like the other she had touched, and it was not a calm pool she could send ripples through, and it was not a garden she could plant seeds in. It was chaos, pure, screaming, beautiful chaos. 1,000 thoughts crashed against each other like waves in a storm, and memories and fears and hopes and jokes and worries and plans and random observations all tumbled together in a hurricane of mental noise, and she could not find a single thread to grab onto. Velastra blinked. Ambassador Chun also blinked. "Are you all right, princess?" he asked, and he tilted his head slightly. "You look like you might have something in your eye." the chamber went silent. The other council species stared with expressions ranging from shock to barely hidden delight, and the Valkyrie were feared across 12 star systems, and everyone knew their power, and everyone knew that no one could resist them, and yet this human stood there completely unaffected, and asking if she had something in her eye. Valastra recovered quickly, because she had not survived 800 years by showing weakness. "I am fine, Ambassador," she said, and her voice was smooth as silk, simply adjusting to the station's atmosphere. "Of course," Marcus Chun said, and he smiled again, and it was a genuine smile without any fear or awe or desperate desire to please. "Shall we begin the negotiations then?" They took their seats, and the formal discussions began, and Valastra spoke the words she had prepared, and she made the arguments her advisors had crafted, but her mind was elsewhere. She studied the other humans at the table, and there was a woman with dark skin and a warrior's build who watched everything with sharp eyes, and this was Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo, the security chief, and there was a young man who kept taking notes, and an older woman who seemed to be some kind of scientist, and another man who appeared to be falling asleep. Valastra tried her power again and again, and each time she reached out, she found the same maddening chaos, and their minds were not shielded, and they had no psychic defenses that she could detect, and they were simply too loud and too messy and too contradictory for her to find any purchase for the first time in 847 years. Princess Valastra Nixthorian felt the unfamiliar sting of embarrassment, and deep beneath that embarrassment was something she had not felt since she was a child, and she did not want to name it, but it whispered in the back of her mind. It was fear. These strange, fragile young creatures from a small blue world in an unremarkable solar system had done something that no species in recorded history had ever accomplished. They had resisted her. Without even knowing they were being attacked, the negotiations continued, and the words flowed, and agreements were discussed and rejected and modified. But Valastra was no longer listening. She was thinking, and she was planning, and she was wondering what other secrets these humans might be hiding. And for the first time in centuries, she felt genuinely interested in something other than power. She felt curious. 3 days had passed since the failed attempt, and Valastra had barely slept, and she had spent every waking hour studying the humans from a distance and trying to understand how such simple creatures could resist her power. Her private chambers on the station were decorated in the style of her homeworld, and shadows moved like living things along the walls, and the light was always dim and red, and a fountain of what appeared to be dark wine bubbled quietly in the corner. Morthex entered without knocking, because he had served her for 200 years, and he knew when she needed information more than privacy. "I have compiled everything we know about humanity, my princess," he said, and his forearms spread data screens in the air before her. Their biology and their history and their culture and their psychology. Valastra waved a pale hand. "Tell me the important parts." They are omnivores who evolved as persistence hunters, and they would chase prey for hours until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, and they developed large brains and social structures, and they are intensely tribal, but also capable of cooperation beyond their immediate group. Morthex paused, and his compound eyes flickered. "They are remarkably violent, my princess, and their history is filled with wars and genocides and cruelty toward their own kind. Then they should be easy to manipulate," Valastra said, and frustration crept into her voice. "Fear and tribalism are simple tools to exploit." "One would think so," Morthex agreed. "But there is something strange about them, and their neural patterns are unlike any species we have encountered. And they seem to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, and they can want something and not want it at the same time, and they can believe something and doubt it in the same breath." Valastra stood and walked to her window, and she looked out at the stars. The whisper of want requires a clear desire to reflect back at the target, and if their desires are constantly shifting and contradicting themselves, Then there is nothing stable to grab onto, Morthex finished. Princess was silent for a long moment, and then she turned and there was a cold determination in her crimson eyes. There are other secrets, she said. The whisper is merely the first, and it is subtle and it is gentle, and perhaps humans require something more direct. She thought of her second secret, and it was called the blood echo, and it was older than the whisper, and it was more intimate, and it was more dangerous. The Valkyrie were not merely psychic predators, and they were also creatures of blood, and when they consumed the blood of another species, they could taste that species' genetic memory and every fear and every triumph and every instinct that had been passed down through millions of years of evolution. With this knowledge, a Valkyrie could find the deepest, most primal fears buried in a species' collective unconscious, and they could use those fears like weapons. Arrange a cultural exchange dinner, Velastra commanded. Humans appreciate such gestures. I will find a way to acquire a sample of their blood. Morthex bowed his strange body. It shall be done, my princess. The dinner was held 2 days later in one of the station's grand halls, and the human delegation seemed genuinely pleased by the invitation, and Ambassador Chun even made a small speech about the importance of understanding between species. Velastra smiled and nodded and played the gracious host, and she watched and she waited. The opportunity came during the fourth course when a serving drone malfunctioned and dropped a tray of crystal glasses, and the shards scattered across the floor. Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo moved fast, and she pushed Ambassador Chung out of the way, and a piece of crystal sliced across her palm, and blood welled up bright and red. Velastra was at her side in an instant. Please, she said, and her voice was full of concern. Allow me to help. And before anyone could object, she had taken Sarah's hand in her own. Blood touched her pale skin, and she absorbed it without anyone noticing. And it was just a few drops, but it would be enough. The medical drone will see to this, Velastra said. Then she released Sarah's hand and smiled her most charming smile. I do hope this small accident will not sour the evening. Sarah looked at her with those sharp warrior's eyes, and for a moment Velastra thought the human suspected something, but then Sarah simply nodded. I have had worse, she said. Thank you for your concern, princess. Later that night, Velastra sat alone in her chambers, and she prepared herself for the blood echo, and it was not a pleasant experience, and it required opening her mind completely to another species' genetic memory, and that could be overwhelming, but she had done it many times before, and she had tasted the fears of the Grothmer and the Kelvari and the Whisperkin, and she had learned their weaknesses and used them without mercy. She closed her eyes, and she focused on the human blood that now flowed through her system, and she reached out with her ancient senses, and she touched the genetic memory of humanity, and the universe exploded. Images crashed into her mind like a meteor striking a planet, and she saw humans huddled in caves while predators circled outside, and she felt their terror of the dark and their fear of the things with teeth and claws that waited in the night. But then she saw them pick up sticks and stones, and she felt them make fire, and suddenly the predators were running from them. She saw them cross frozen wastelands and burning deserts and vast oceans and every environment that should have killed them, and somehow they survived, and they adapted, and they conquered. She saw their plagues and their wars and their famines, and she felt the weight of billions of deaths, and she also felt something impossible, and she felt them get back up after every catastrophe and start again. The blood echo showed her their fears, and there were so many fears, and they feared death and disease and loneliness and failure and meaninglessness and the dark and the deep water and heights and small spaces in each other. But every single fear was matched by a memory of overcoming it. They feared wolves, so they tamed wolves and made them into loyal companions. And they feared the ocean, so they built ships, and they feared the sky, so they built wings, and they feared the void of space, so they built rockets. And when any wave, Lustra screamed, and she could not process it all, and the sheer weight of human experience was crushing her. And there was too much, and it was too loud, and it was too contradictory, and it was too alive. She collapsed, and the last thing she saw before darkness took her was a vision of a small blue planet spinning in the void and billions of chaotic, impossible stubborn minds all burning with the same fundamental message: we are afraid, but we go forward anyway. When Velastra opened her eyes, she was in the station's medical bay, and the lights were too bright, and her head was pounding, and someone was sitting beside her bed. It was Ambassador Marcus Chun, and he looked worried. "You gave us quite a scare, Princess," he said, and his voice was gentle. "You just collapsed in the middle of your own dinner party, and no one knew what was wrong." Velastra tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and Marcus handed her a glass of water, and she drank it slowly. "What happened?" he asked. "Is there something we can do to help?" She looked at him, and she really looked at him for the first time, and she did not see prey or a target or an obstacle. She saw a member of a species that had been afraid of everything and had conquered everything, and she saw someone who came from a people who should have died 1,000 times, but kept choosing to survive. And, for the first time in centuries, Princess Velastra Nixthorian did not know what to say. She had sought human weakness in their blood, and instead, she had found something terrifying. She had found a species that had already faced every nightmare the universe could offer, and they were still here. 2 weeks had passed since the blood echo had nearly destroyed her, and Velastra had told no one what she had experienced, and she had simply said that she suffered from a rare condition, and the humans had accepted this explanation with what seemed like genuine concern. She found their concern confusing. The negotiations continued, and they were not going well, and the other council species had noticed that the humans seemed immune to Valkyrie influence, and whispers spread through the station like poison, and old alliances began to shift. Velastra received a message from her regent back on the homeworld, and the regent's face was cold and beautiful, and her words were even colder. "The Dominion needs this alliance, Princess, and our resources are failing, and the Krathvar are pushing at our borders, and if you cannot secure council membership through your gifts, then perhaps we chose the wrong princess for this mission." The threat was clear, and Velastra had siblings, and they were younger and hungrier, and they would be happy to take her place. So she turned to her third secret, and it was the most intimate of all, and it was called the Covenant of Shadows. Unlike the whisper, which merely suggested, and unlike the blood echo, which merely informed, the covenant actually created a bond between the Valkyrie and their target, and the target would become a thrall, and they would serve willingly and joyfully, and they would believe themselves beloved. It was not mind control, and it was something worse, and it was making someone want to be controlled. The process took time, and it required building a genuine emotional connection first, and then twisting that connection into chains, and the target would never even know they had been enslaved. Velastra chose her target carefully, and she chose Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo. Sarah was the security chief, and she was the protector of the human delegation. And if Velastra could turn her, then she would have a weapon pointed at the heart of the human negotiating team. And there was something else, and Velastra did not want to admit it, but Sarah reminded her of herself, and Sarah was a warrior, and she was proud, and she was fierce, and she was alone in ways that others could not. Velastra began her campaign with small gestures, and she would appear in the training areas when Sarah was practicing, and she would comment on Sarah's technique and offer to spar. "Your people fight with such passion," Velastra said, after their first match, and Sarah had won, and Velastra had let her win, but only barely. "We fight to survive," Sarah replied, and she was breathing hard, and there was a light in her eyes that Velastra had not expected. "We have always had to fight for everything." They sparred again the next day, and the day after, and Sarah won more than she should have, and Velastra found herself not pretending as much as she had planned. They began sharing meals together, and Velastra told stories of her homeworld and the endless nights and the crystal forests and the songs of the blood singers, and Sarah listened with genuine interest, and asked questions that surprised Velastra with their depth. "Do you ever get lonely?" Sarah asked one evening, and they were sitting in an observation lounge, and the stars wheeled slowly past the windows. "Living so long, I mean, and watching everything change around you." No one had ever asked Velastra that question, and she had been surrounded by servants and advisors and subjects for 800 years, and none of them had ever wondered if she was lonely. "Yes," she heard herself say, and the word escaped before she could stop it. "I have been lonely for longer than your species has existed." Sarah nodded slowly. "That sounds terrible," she said. And there was no pity in her voice, and there was only understanding. "I have been lonely too, and even surrounded by my team. I sometimes feel like there is a wall between me and everyone else, and like, no one really sees me." Velastra felt something shift inside her chest, and it was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and she pushed it aside. Weeks continued, and they trained together, and they talked together, and they shared silences that were not awkward, and Velastra learned that Sarah had lost her mother young, and had raised her younger siblings, and had joined the military because she needed structure and purpose. Sarah learned that Velastra had been engineered from birth for manipulation and had never been allowed to form genuine connections, and had been taught that love was weakness and friendship was a tool. "That is sad," Sarah said simply. "You deserved better." And Velastra realized with a cold shock that she had not been manipulating Sarah for the past 3 weeks, and she had been enjoying her company, and she had been telling the truth, and she had made a friend. The realization terrified her. She was running out of time, and the regent's messages were becoming more threatening. And so one night after they had sparred and shared a quiet dinner, Velastra reached out with her power to form the covenant. She extended psychic tendrils toward Sarah's mind, and she sought the emotional connection they had built, and she began to twist it and to bind it, and to make Sarah hers. But Sarah's eyes snapped open, and she grabbed Valastra's wrist, and her grip was strong, and her gaze was steady. "I felt that," Sarah said, and her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Whatever you just tried to do, and the answer is no." Velastra froze, and her power recoiled, and no one had ever been able to feel the covenant before, and no one had ever simply said no. "How?" she whispered. "I do not know," Sarah admitted. "It felt like something was trying to wrap around my heart, and I just knew I did not want it there." She paused, and she did not release Valastra's wrist. "You have been trying to manipulate me this whole time." It was not a question. Velastra could not speak, and she could not move, and she waited for the anger and the betrayal and the hatred, but Sarah surprised her again. "Here is the thing," Sarah said. "I think you started out trying to manipulate me, and maybe that is just what your people do, and I get it, and we all have our training." She loosened her grip, but did not let go. "But I also think somewhere along the way you stopped pretending, and I think our conversations were real, and I think you actually like me. I was trying to enslave you," Velastra said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, and that was not great." Sarah agreed. "But you failed, and you failed because something in you did not want to succeed." She finally released Valastra's wrist. "So here is my offer. And if you want to actually be friends and real friends with no psychic nonsense, then I am here for that and your call." Velastra stared at her, and 800 years of training screamed at her to attack or to flee or to try again with more force. But she did none of those things. Instead, she stood up and she walked to the door, and she paused with her hand on the control panel. "I do not know how to be a real friend," she admitted, and her voice cracked on the words. "I was never taught." "Neither was I," Sarah said. "We can figure it out together." Velastra fled to her quarters, and she did not emerge for 2 days, and she spent that time staring at the walls and asking herself questions she had never thought to ask. Who was she without her powers? What did she want that was not about control, and why did the thought of Sarah's friendship feel More valuable than any thrall she had ever made. She did not have answers, but for the first time in centuries, she wanted to find them. The situation had become desperate, and the Galactic Council had begun to turn against the sanguine dominion and species that had once cowered before the Valkyrie were now openly questioning their treaties, and the whispers had become shouts that humans had broken something fundamental, and by simply existing and by simply being immune, they had shown the galaxy that the Valkyrie could be resisted. Valastra's regent sent a final message, and her face was twisted with fury, and her words were, "Like knives, you have shamed our entire species, princess, and you have one chance remaining, and use the final secrets and destroy the humans' credibility before the council, or do not bother returning home, and if you fail, then you are no longer Valkyrie, and you are nothing." The message ended, and Valastra sat alone in the dark, and she thought about her options. She could use her fourth secret, and it was called the Mirror of Selves, and it was cruel, and it was effective, and it had broken entire civilizations. The mirror allowed her to project illusions, drawn from a target's own subconscious, and she could show them their darkest selves, and their greatest shamas, and their most terrible fears made manifest, and she could make them believe that the monster in the mirror was their true self-species with strong shame cultures, crumbled before the mirror, and some had been driven to despair so complete that they had surrendered without a fight. She did not want to use it on the humans, and something had changed inside her, and her conversations with Sarah had planted seeds of doubt, and she found herself hesitating in ways she never had before. But the alternative was exile, and it was death, and it was the end of everything. She knew so. She went to the council chamber on the day of the final vote, and she found Ambassador Marcus Chun speaking to a group of delegates, and she gathered her power, and she unleashed the Mirror of Selves. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, and his eyes went distant, and Valastra could see what he was seeing because the mirror showed her too. He saw himself as a failure, and every decision he had ever made wrong, and every life lost under his command, and every person he had disappointed, and every moment he had not been good enough. The mirror twisted these memories into a monstrous version of Marcus, and it whispered that he was a fraud, and that humanity was a plague, and that they should never have left Earth, and that everything he touched turned to ash. The other delegates watched in confusion as the human ambassador stood frozen and pale and trembling. Valastra pushed harder, and she poured more power into the mirror, and she waited for the collapse and the despair and the surrender that always came. But something strange happened. Marcus Chun began to laugh. It started as a small sound, and it grew, and it was not the laughter of madness, and it was the laughter of recognition, and it was the laughter of someone meeting an old enemy. "Oh, there you are," he said out loud, and the delegates looked even more confused. "I was wondering when you would show up." The mirror flickered, and Valastra pushed again, but the image was breaking apart. "You think I do not know I am flawed?" Marcus said, and his voice was steady now, and he was looking directly at the monster the mirror had created. "You think I do not carry my failures with me every single day, and you think I have not met this version of myself 1,000 times in the dark of night." He stepped toward the illusion, and his eyes were clear, and his hands were steady. "This is not a secret," he said. "This is not a weapon, and every human knows this face because we see it in our own reflections, and we call it the inner critic, or the shadow, or the voice of doubt, and we have been living with it since we first became aware enough to feel shame." The mirror shattered, and the illusion collapsed, and Marcus Chun stood untouched in the middle of the council chamber. "You cannot hurt us with our own darkness," he said, and now he was looking directly at Valastra, and somehow he knew, and somehow he had figured it out. "We have been wrestling with our darkness since the beginning, and that is not a weakness, and that is how we learn, and that is how we grow, and that is how we become better." The council chamber erupted in chaos, and delegates were shouting and pointing and demanding explanations, and The Lastra fled. She returned to her quarters, and she sealed it. Door and she knew that she had failed, and she knew that there was only one option left. The fifth secret and the final throne. It was forbidden among her people, and it was only used as a last resort because it was a weapon that destroyed the wielder. As surely as the target, and it would burn out her mind within decades, but it could enslave an entire species. If performed correctly, she would have to sacrifice herself. But she would complete her mission, and the Dominion would have the humans, and she would have fulfilled her purpose. She spent hours preparing, and she gathered her power, and she focused her will, and she made her way to the observation deck where she knew Marcus. Chum liked to spend his evenings looking at the stars. He was there, as she had expected, and he was alone, and he was the symbolic leader of humanity, and if she bound him, she could bind them all. She approached him silently, and she raised her hands, and she began to summon the final throne, but she hesitated. He turned, and he looked at her, and there was no fear in his eyes, and there was only a kind of sad understanding. "I know what you are here to do," he said quietly. "Sarah warned me, and she told me about your conversation, and she told me about what you tried. And she also told me something else." Valastra's power flickered. "What did she tell you?" "She told me that you have been crying in your quarters, and she told me that you do not want to do this. And she told me that somewhere under all that power and all that training there is someone who just wants to be seen." Valastra felt tears prick at her eyes, and she had not cried in centuries, and she did not even know she still could. "I have to do this," she whispered. "My people need me to do this. And if I fail, I lose everything." Marcus sat down on a bench near the window, and he patted the space beside him. "Want to talk about it?" he asked. And Princess Valastra Nixthorian of the Sanguine Dominion, and wielder of 5 secrets that had bent empires and broken civilizations, and who had never once failed in 847 years of existence, did something she had never done before. She lowered her hands, and she let the final throne fade, and she walked to the bench, and she sat down beside the human ambassador, and she started to tell the truth. The stars wheeled slowly past the observation window, and Valastra sat beside Marcus Chun, and she told him everything. She told him about the Sanguine Dominion, and how it was dying, and how their worlds were running out of resources, and how the Krathvar raiders grew bolder every year, and how her people desperately needed allies. She told him about the 5 secrets, and how she had been trained since birth to use them, and how she had never questioned whether it was right, and how she had simply assumed that power and control were the same thing. She told him about her regent and the threats, and how she would be exiled or killed if she returned home without success, and how she had no other home to go to. And she told him about Sarah and the failed covenant, and how she had discovered something terrifying and wonderful in that moment of rejection, and she had discovered that she wanted a real friend more than she wanted a thrall. When she finished, she waited for the judgment and the anger, the disgust, but Marcus just nodded slowly and looked out at the stars. "You know what is funny?" he said finally. "Your secrets are basically just manipulation tactics, and humans do all of that stuff to each other constantly." Valastra blinked. "What do you mean?" "The whisper of want, and that is just advertising. And that is politicians telling people what they want to hear. And that is every salesperson who ever lived." Marcus counted on his fingers. "The blood echo, and we call that understanding your audience and knowing their fears and their desires and their history. And we study it and we teach it in schools, and we call it psychology and marketing." He continued, "The covenant of shadows, and we have a word for that too, and we call it grooming or love bombing or emotional manipulation, and abusers use it and cults use it. And we have spent centuries learning to recognize it and fight it." "And the mirror of selves?" Valastra asked quietly. "That is the voice in every human's head that tells them they are not good enough," Marcus said. "We call it the inner critic or imposter syndrome or the shame spiral. And we have been living with that voice since we first developed self-awareness, and we have had to learn to recognize it and talk back to it and keep going anyway." Velastra felt something crack inside her, and it was the foundation of everything she had believed about power and control. "You enslave your own kind," she whispered. "We used to," Marcus admitted, "slavery. An oppression and manipulation, and we did it all, and we still struggle with it. And we still have people who try to control others through fear and shame and desire." He paused. "But we also figured out something that maybe your people missed." "What is that?" "The best way to get someone on your side is not to control them," he said, and his voice was gentle but firm. "It is to give them a reason to want to be there, and cooperation beats domination in the long run, and every single time." He turned to face her, and his eyes were kind. "Empires built on control always fall," he said. "The Valkyrie must know that, and you have watched it happen for thousands of years in species. Rise and species fall, and the ones who try to dominate always end up alone and afraid, and wondering why their power was not enough." Velastra felt the tears spilling down her cheeks, and she could not stop them. "I do not know any other way," she admitted. "Control is all I was ever taught, then learned something new." Marcus, simply, "You are 800 years old, and you have time, and Sarah says you are a quick study." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, and he set it on the bench between them. "Here is my offer," he said. "Humanity will advocate for the Sanguine Dominion's Council membership, and not as conquerors or manipulators, but as partners and in exchange. You teach us everything about your psychic techniques, so we can develop countermeasures for other species and your people. Begin reforming their practices, and they learn that there are better ways to build alliances than enslavement." Velastra stared at him. "You would help us after everything I tried to do to you." "You did not succeed," Marcus pointed out, "and you stopped yourself at the end, and that counts for something. And besides, we have a saying on Earth, and it goes, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and I would rather have a reforming vampire princess as a friend than as an enemy. And if my regent refuses," Velastra asked, "if my people reject this offer," Marcus shrugged, "then you stay here and political asylum, and we protect you, and you help us understand the galaxy. And Sarah says she would like that actually." Velastra thought about her homeworld, and the endless nights and the crystal forests and the cold, beautiful cruelty of everything she had ever known. And then she thought about Sarah's hand reaching back when she had tried to bind her, and Marcus sitting beside her asking if she wanted to talk, and the warmth in their voices when they spoke to her, and the way they treated her like a person instead of a weapon. "I need to make a call," she said. She stood and walked to a communication terminal as she contacted her regent, and she made her counteroffer, and she explained the human proposal, and she waited. Regent laughed. "You expect us to humble ourselves before these children, and you expect us to give up our power, and you have lost your mind. Princess, then I am no longer coming home," Velastra said, and the words felt like breaking chains. "I accept their offer of asylum, and I renounce my claim to the throne, and let my siblings fight over it, and I am done." She ended the transmission before the regent could respond. When she turned back to Marcus, he was smiling, and Sarah was standing in the doorway, and Velastra had not even heard her arrive. "Well," Sarah said, "looks like you are stuck with us now." 3 years passed, and they were the strangest and most wonderful years of Velastra's long life. She became Ambassador Velastra, Nixthorian, and she represented the reformed Sanguine territories, which were the worlds that had followed her into exile and had rejected the old ways and had chosen cooperation over control. It was not many worlds at first, but the number grew every year. She stood in the council chamber beside Marcus and Sarah, and she watched a new species request membership, and she remembered standing in this same room 8 centuries ago and believing that power was everything. A young Valkyrie, attached from the Reform faction, approached her nervously. "Ambassador," the young one said, "how do the humans resist us so easily, and what is their secret?" Velastra smiled, and she let her fangs show just a little. "They do not have one. she said. They have something better. She watched Marcus crack a terrible joke and Sarah groan and the rest of the delegation laugh, and she felt the warmth of genuine connection spread through her chest. They have each other, she said. And now so do we. The young Valkyrie looked confused but nodded respectfully and walked away. Velastra turned back to the stars, and she thought about the 5 secrets that had once defined her, and she thought about how useless they had proven against beings who had already faced every manipulation the universe could offer, and she thought about the 6th secret and the one she had discovered on a bench beside a human who had asked if she wanted to talk. The secret was simple, and it was this: real power was not about bending wills, and real power was about building something together, and real strength was not about control, and real strength was about trust. The Valkyrie had spent millennia learning to dominate, and the humans had spent millennia learning to connect, and in the end, the humans had won without even trying. Velastra looked at her friends, and she smiled. She was glad they had.